Morning, everybody, and a very big welcome from Talent Talks and Life Online. For those of you who new and don't know Talent Talks and Life Online, we are digital content platforms. We curate and publish fresh content weekly, all designed to help people be smarter about their careers, workplaces, and lives. Do visit our website, talenttalks.net, and enjoy our weekly newsletter. A huge thank you to our sponsor, Advisory And. Advisory And have an exciting and innovative approach to well-being, and they recently launched the Wellbeing Index Diagnostic. You can find out more about it on our site, and we'll be also sending you some more information along with the recording of this webinar. On that happy note, I have great pleasure in introducing you to Joe Watt of Talent Brand, who will be facilitating this session this morning. Thank you very much, Joe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. To kick off, I'll start off with just an introduction to some ideas and some concepts. We will then move into some discussions with the panel, and then we'll close off with one of Lita's amazing demonstrations and illustrations of our conversation today. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off. So, of course, welcome to the second episode of our Rehumanizing Business webinar series, where we explore reimagining people practices. It's wonderful that you could all join us, and our hope is that the second episode will continue to spark some interesting debate and imagining on how existing people practices are in fact toxic and significantly impact on how engaged, energized and connected our people are. On today's show, we have Steve Teasdale, Group Head of Organizational Development, Wellness and Transformation of the Discovery Group. Steve is deeply passionate about supporting organizations to become highly effective systems in the new world of work and firmly believes the role of leadership is the fundamental component to effectively executing organizational strategy. And Njabula Moshigo, the Executive Director of HR, welcome Njabula from Vodacom South Africa, who is passionate about HR professional development and the critical role HR has to play in this challenging new world of work. And then Geraldine Bruce, the founder of Nudge Africa, a consultancy focusing on all things talent acquisition. With 30 years in the industry, Geraldine is passionate about the dynamic practice of connecting people to meaningful work and growing a business's competitive edge with a great hiring team and strategy. As a recap, the idea for this series was sparked by the documentary The Corporation and its sequel, released at the end of last year, The New Corporation. These can both be found on Netflix, which posed the very provocative question: if corporations are considered by law to be legal persons, what type of person would they be? The conclusion was that they would be classified as psychopaths, as they single-mindedly pursue commercial profits without much consideration for the economic, social, and environmental costs that may result from this pursuit. In our first webinar, hosted by Mike Middleton, The Evolution of Human Consciousness and Corporate Culture, we explored the likelihood that the current corporate culture is a system where employees feel like they are treated as disposable commodities and discarded when their usefulness comes to an end, or on the other end, completely disengaged due to what Carol Sanford refers to in her books, The Regenerative Business and No More Feedback, as a result of toxic people practices. We know all the talk and the buzz at the moment is about the big resignation, where people are leaving their jobs and companies in droves worldwide, and where I believe in South Africa, the big resignation refers to physically leaving and or actively disengaging. And I've certainly, in my talent acquisition practice, come across a significant number of people who are doing exactly that. And the other side is where employees choose to be purely transactional in their relationship with their employer, usually as a result of no psychological safety at work, but can't afford to resign, so therefore doing the least amount of work to ensure they remain employed in exchange for that paycheck. The latest global workforce trends from Gallup says employee engagement remains dismally low at 20% globally. This means that the large majority of employees in the world are either watching the clock or actively opposing their employer. Employees' disengagement creates a drag on productivity, we know that, innovation and organizational change. And the scary number, Gallup estimates that low engagement costs the global economy around $8.1 trillion. As Mike mentioned in the first webinar, we know that human consciousness is evolving way ahead of how organizations are transforming, and that gap has widened even more thanks to the pandemic. The big resignation is just one of the many consequences and/or symptoms that tells us we need a complete transformation in organizations if there is any hope of them thriving in the future. In this webinar, we explore Carol Sanford's deeply rooted belief that people can grow and develop way beyond what their leaders or anyone else sees possible, to become increasingly entrepreneurial, innovative, and responsible in their businesses, in their jobs, and in their personal actions. One that unlocks significant new levels of innovation, delivers enduring financial results, creates exceptional customer loyalty, while simultaneously building human capacity to contribute to ongoing positive change. You can refer to carolsanford.com or carolsanfordinstitute.com, where she frames her view of building human capacity using 3 fundamental principles, and then applying these principles to what she describes as toxic people practices and why they are so toxic. So here I go. Let's go and explore these concepts, and I hope to be able to relay them for those who have not been exposed to this type of thinking before. Human beings have far more potential than they achieve in their short lives. But to grow our human potential, we need to focus on developing 3 criteria. And when we do, we enable people to take the kind of risk that produces strong businesses and, by extension, stronger individuals, families, and democracies. Carol Sanford refers to this as the triad of human potential. And she calls the first one locus of control, the second one scope of considering, and 3 source of agency. These are innate in all people, yet most of our societal roles offer very few opportunities to develop them. Locus of control speaks to the degree to which we experience and exercise control over our own lives, particularly in the direction of our self-development and resilience to adversity. It's about taking full responsibility for our own actions. All of us are on some spectrum between external and internal locus of control. So in a nutshell, we move from external, seeing our lives determined by others, to internal, taking accountability for what we do in terms of outcomes and direction. We usually have settled on one or the other by the time we reach adulthood. Anyone, and I'm sure you can relate to this, who has a very strong internal locus of control is typically the person questioning every policy, the one representing a group to speak up to a CEO, and are typically labeled as the rebel or the maverick in an organization, but are usually admired for their guts and their courage. The second leg of this triad, scope of considering, relates to what we consider in our actions and endeavors, especially in relation to other people and living beings. We may be self-centered and inwardly focused, or we may consider the effects of our actions on other individuals and groups or entire living systems. The difference is between a self-centered focus on oneself alone and a system actualizing focus on the larger whole. And when we speak about the larger whole, we're talking about marriage, family, organization, our communities within which we live in, our industries, the ecosystem, and our planet to create beneficial changes. It is within the context of external considering that we reflect on our purpose. That what we care about is whole and alive with its own purpose and potential, and is ultimately an active commitment to increase the capacity to fulfill one's own purpose and potential. The force that lets a business create radical change is released when all its people are passionately engaged in creating and holding themselves accountable for innovations that will make a difference in a larger world. Essentially, when we consider ourselves, internal considering, every situation we encounter is all about us. But if we are sensitive to others in our world and to other forms of life, we have developed a degree of external considering, and like locus of control, we can either be at one end of the spectrum or anywhere in between. Anyone who follows Louis Pu, the Arctic swimmer who is currently at COP26, whose motto, no ice, no life, and is well known for his freezing cold swims across the channel, will recognize what a beautiful role model he is, with a very deep-rooted sense of external considering. Source of agency refers to where we find authority for our initiatives and our actions. We may rely almost exclusively on the authority of others to direct us, or we may have within us the will to initiate action ourselves and follow through with self-directed effort, known as personal agency. The more we can direct ourselves, the better our capability is to connect to larger systems and to help actualize them. It's about people becoming active players, taking responsibility for the effects they want to create. And personal agency is needed in business because people need to take appropriate initiative. A workforce of people who can see what needs to be done and who will step into it is far more powerful than one that depends on delegation to know what to do. Source of agency is likewise very fluid, but tends to be directed by beliefs we hold about our own role in the world and who has the power or influence over us. When we live according to an authoritarian view, we often wait for others who we deem important to activate, direct, or stop us. But as we become driven internally and come to believe the world is ours, we begin moving towards a life devoted to making a difference and stepping up. And if you think back to the Me Too movement, it's a wonderful example of how many women suddenly decided their personal agency was something that they were in control of. By growing human capacity through using these criteria, it is possible to test the regenerative potential of any work design. And Carol insists that for a business or organization to work in a coherent and systemic way, all three must be present and rigorously cultivated in an organization. Therefore, being so bold as to aim that making employees actually responsible for everything, from initiating strategic thinking and actions to self-evaluation with regards to performance. Interestingly, in our first webinar, Mike referred to Frederic Laloux's book. He speaks about the emerging human consciousness being represented by the metaphor, the living system, which takes the definition of success to an even higher level. It says that a successful life is one where we are the truest and most authentic expression of ourselves, where we honor our natural gifts and abilities, where we follow our calling, and where we are of service to humanity. In other words, we are less impacted by our ego and the need to impress others, and more driven by our innate desire to follow our purpose and be of service to humanity. Instead of taking as much as we can from the world, we look for ways of making it better, creating a naturally regenerating living system. So similar concepts to what we are expressing here. A famous quote by R. Buckminster Fuller from his book Critical Path says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And I think it's important to recognize that we are talking about a whole new way of unlocking human potential, and to imagine a workplace where people, employees, see themselves and their behavior so clearly that no feedback or other assistance is needed to guide them in their work, where they are taught to engage in self-reflection, self-direction, and self-management of their own growth and development. Now, to link these three fundamentals and apply them to some of the toxic practices Carol refers to in her research and subsequently in her books, The Regenerative Business. Carol discusses 30 of them and classifies them into 4 paradigms. She talks about the aristocracy machine, the behavioral, the human, and the human potential. I will briefly unpack them with 1 or 2 examples to demonstrate how they link back to our locus of control, external considering, and personal agency. The aristocracy paradigm is really about where the control of ownership leads to bureaucratization. One of the oldest unconscious beliefs influencing business practice is the idea that some small segment of the population is regarded as more superior than the rest and should be entrusted with decision-making on behalf of everyone. For example, the CEO, where personal will is replaced or subordinated to the will of the leader. Hierarchies are not designed to organize thinking, but to organize people to do different levels of thinking, and therefore define different levels of authority, responsibility, and power. This leads to bureaucracy. It speaks to how only a small group do the creative thinking and decision-making, and thereby limiting the contributions others can make. It violates internal locus of control and personal agency by undermining intrinsic motivation and accountability. So let's take an example. Let's talk about job descriptions. We know job descriptions are there to communicate the place that individuals will fill within the system as a whole and the boundaries within which they may exercise creativity. Job descriptions enable an organization to ensure that all necessary work has been assigned. They are intended to eliminate confusion and conflict about what is expected and appropriate. In a hierarchy, job descriptions are always determined by the organization, and the expectation is that the employees will adapt themselves to the needs that have been defined. Job descriptions are particularly corrosive, in Carol's view, to initiative and personal agency and innovation. They are based on fixed ideas about tasks and competencies that the company will need. And what they fail to consider is that human beings have the inherent ability to observe a changing world, recognize what's going to be needed, figure out how to do it, and learn the skills to produce it. Innovative businesses organize themselves around intrinsic motivation and the creative energy of individuals. Now let's talk about the machine paradigm, which is really the control over process which leads to routinization. In the previous webinar, Mike spoke at length about the machine paradigm. At the heart of this paradigm is an intense focus on the achievement of goals and objectives, most of which are designed to maximize shareholder return. The dark side of this paradigm, though, is unbridled greed, which we experience daily, from global warming and climate change to the depletion of our natural resources, growing inequality, Me Too movements, excessive consumerism, and so the list goes on. Carol goes on to say that a business based on the machine paradigm sees people as skill sets, views tasks as problems to be solved, and treats the organizations as the means by which people manage the parts to get the results they want. It dehumanizes people by imagining them as generic and interchangeable cogs. This leads to a host of business practices that have been around long enough and are so familiar that they've become to be seen as business realities rather than business choices. So let's use one well-known example, competencies. Those functional capabilities that need to be present for an organization to operate successfully. They are definable and measurable, which makes it possible to assess whether they are present. For example, a proficiency in a software program. Functional capabilities are also impersonal, which is key to making personnel interchangeable. A business that requires core competencies can buy it or train for it, because it's the competency that matters and not the individual. Competencies are directly opposite to innovation. It locks the business into skills that are generic and repeatable. They are appropriate to situations that are unchanging rather than to those that are dynamic. They treat people as though they are generic too, rather than unique, creative beings with the ability to learn and grow and bring something unexpected and inspired to work. Let's move on. The behavioral paradigm. This is where control over labor leads to external motivation. The machine paradigm enabled rapid development in the industrial era, but at some point, the speed and predictability of machines outstripped the predictability of operating them. The attention now shifted from how to control the manufacturing processes to how to control labor. Behavioral psychology is effective in large part because it taps into characteristics that humans share with other animals. Based on research on rats and primates, behaviorists were able to accurately describe how to condition people's behavior. Like the aristocratic and mechanistic paradigms before it, this approach assumes an outside authority whose goals drive all activity and therefore shape employee behavior. It ignores and fails to take advantage of the many higher functions of human intelligence. Companies and all their people have the innate potential for reflection and self-management, qualities needed to develop to move into uncharted territories where innovation occurs. Incentives is a lovely example of what we mean here. It is the promise of a future reward designed to stimulate a single-minded pursuit. For example, salespeople promise bonuses for exceeding targets. An incentive generates a very specific stimulating effect on the brain by highlighting the gap between what people have and what they could have. This creates the compelling desire to close the gap and thus serve as a source of energy to drive the development of desired behaviors and outcomes. Because incentives trigger a primitive ingrained response, they produce a number of unintended consequences, such as promoting oneself, so much so that people dedicate a great deal of creative energy to the counterproductive purpose of gaming the system. Secondly, they focus on the incentive rather than the customer. And thirdly, they reduce the sense of agency and locus of control in the employee, placing it instead in the hands of those who are creating the incentives and providing the rewards. It undermines self-managing and, in a sense, treats employees like children. Finally, the human potential paradigm. This is where self-actualization leads to internal motivation. The human potential movement, led by influential humanistic psychologists such as Maslow and Carl Rogers, rejected a system that treated people as if they were merely tools, celebrating instead the idea that human beings were inherently worthy. They proposed the pursuit of potential inherent in each person. However, the human potential movement had one fundamental blind spot. It kept the focus inward and human, and therefore did not adequately consider the relationship between humans and the larger systems that we interact with, especially natural systems. They misunderstood the fundamental insight that humans need to be the authors of their own choices and actions. They took the concept of human development to be simply a replacement for the concept of performance. And if we look at organizational surveys as an example, surveys of an organizational climate and culture are designed to help businesses develop an objective and unbiased understanding about how people feel about the overall work experience. Employees' opinions are solicited on everything from fairness in hiring and pay to personal fulfillment at work. The aim being to engage employees to help companies provide a supportive work environment. But like most feedback processes, surveys of this nature gather info about people's likes and dislikes within the frame of existing experiences. They invite superficial reactions rather than deep creative thinking. This is anti-innovative because they add nothing to the kind of insight that would put an organization at the forefront of employee experience. Finally, they also have the effect of separating employees from their own personal agency. Rather than encouraging co-responsibility for creating conditions for meaningful work, surveys simply imply that someone else will take responsibility for the info that has been gathered and the amount of time it takes to move up the chain and back again in the forms of some new program. It bears little relationship to what was originally articulated. The employee ultimately complaining, and sometimes very out loud, why do they ask me when they don't intend to do anything about it? So, Steve, I'm going to direct my first question to you. You are deeply passionate about supporting organizations to become highly effective systems. In the new world of work, with experience in the likes of ESCOM and Discovery, where should one start the journey of transformation? And what in your experience must be in place, considering Carol Sanford and Frederick Laloux's perspective that we are part of a connected and living system, and how does this translate into the future world of work?
Thanks, Joe. I mean, listening to Carol's work coming through has left me in a space of potentially saying there's plenty that I'm aligned with, and then there's maybe exercising my own locus of control and personal agency. There are things that I think she sometimes is a bit binary on, but one thing I know for sure, she's far cleverer than me and she knows more than me. So I'm probably wrong. What needs to be in place? I think for me, it is this concept of purpose that sits at the heart of everything. As organizations start to think about the kind of their why, it's incredibly important that they consider something which fits into this frame of something bigger than self. And for me, that really talks to being very clear around the difference you want to make to the world. And this is so important that this is not superficial. And I think this is, we know that purpose has been something which has been incredibly popular over the last sort of couple of years. But for me, it's something which an organization needs to, if they don't have it yet, they really need to spend some time thinking about the difference they can make in the world. So, and this is something which I must say my own organization is incredibly passionate about. And maybe I can just sort of reflect on the gap still, I think, around this stuff, because purpose is incredibly important. But we need to then drag that purpose through to ourselves. And as business units within that organization, there needs to be a clear alignment. But perhaps more importantly, this personal purpose, your personal why. And I think Carol Sanford refers to as it's almost something she calls a nested why, if I remember correctly. And even Simon Sinek nested purpose, and Simon Sinek calls a nested why. And this is based on this concept of systems thinking, and that if you're part of a system, you can't have your own personal purpose, but you can have a nested purpose. But those are incredibly important because alignment across these organizations, between the organization and yourself is massively powerful. And this comes through in the theory of meaning and many other aspects. But what I think we sometimes forget to do is to empower and enable and liberate people to establish their purpose in the context of an organization. I think that's a massive opportunity for the modern organization and the new world of work. And that has to be deeply human. I think that the role of consciousness there is the difficult part. So in some ways, starting the journey of transformations, while I wouldn't say easier, it's the easier part. Sustaining this modern day organization that delivers purpose and meaning to the world is the difficult part. And the concept that I'm particularly interested in and starting to make sense to me is the concept of shared value. So what's good for me as an individual is also good for an organization, but has to also at the same time be good for society. And these things are not mutually exclusive. So as organizations start to think about the how behind the why, I think they really need to consider this concept of shared value. And the reason why I like shared value is it's self-sustaining. Because while we reach ultimate consciousness, which is sort of utopia, there is an element of getting benefit that generates action. And I think this is the difference maybe that I have with the concept of incentives. I hear the narrative around incentives being a dangerous thing, which I agree with. If I sort of put out there that if incentives are of a shared value nature, I'm thinking hopefully they're a good thing and they're possible. So maybe the easy example, and it's a bit sort of personal to our particular organization, but if you think about the concept of vitality, what we're doing there is we are making you healthier. So we're incentivizing your own health and living and prosperity and all those good things. Equally, we're able to price risk differently. There's less medical claims for us, so we're winning out of it. But there's less burden on the health system and less burden generally. So this is a simple example, and you see this play out in every single product that we have. What we're very firm on is we won't do anything that doesn't have shared value. And this is sort of living into that purpose to make people healthy and enhance and protect their lives has enabled us to kind of understand where our system goes off course. And it does all the time, I think, So I think that, where we start is having this really clear view of purpose, helping people get to purpose, then entering the how, being, in our case, shared values, but in many organizations, the values in which they operate, not forgetting organizational structure. And I know there's some very cool stuff out there around liberating structures and those sorts of things, which I think is incredibly powerful. And then what you do as an organization also matters. The things you sell and the products you deliver and the services you create need to be done in the context of that how. And I think if you're doing this repeatedly, you're getting closer and closer to that world of work, which is, I think, something we're all pretty excited about, and something which is making a difference to the world at the same time it's making a difference to the organization, and at the same time it's making a difference to you as an individual and your family and that system. So I think those are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. And of course, like everything, I agree that leaders really do have a massive role to play to create that environment. And I think she refers to it around needs to be rigorously cultivated. And I think that that's true. But I also am aligned that this concept of personal agency and locus of control is massively important. And of course, the scope of considering the third leg of the triad that you spoke of comes through strongly in purpose. So reflecting on your opening bit, I feel that organizations have a huge opportunity to take some of this learning into the new world of work.
Absolutely. Steve, thank you so much. And just a quick question. In these transformation initiatives that you drive, how do you help leaders stay on track? You get thrown with a pandemic. I mean, that completely changes everything you plan for, what the future is, etc. How would you help leaders who are pursuing this, who are challenging this thinking, who are trying to bring this change about? How do you help them stay accountable and on track? What has been your experience in that regard?
I think my current experience is one where it's an incredibly well cultivated culture. So we're not spending a lot of time trying to convince people of this, of a certain culture. What we're trying to do now is more align behavior with that culture.
Okay.
So spending a lot of time trying to let's understand how we act impacts on behavior, and that happens how we act as an organization, how we act as a business unit, but equally how we act as individual leaders. And I think we're allowed to call out very easily if the values aren't coming alive, and certainly if the purpose isn't coming alive. It's a very quick conversation to emerge amongst leaders. And what I've found is that these things aren't individual; they have tension amongst them. So we have a value of prudence and we have a value of innovation. How do we find the balance there in the context? And the context is often driven by the purpose in which we live. So at one time, that purpose could mean one thing, and another time it could mean something else. And we're very clear in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic how that purpose manifests, and that's been massively powerful to guide leaders.
So really, in a nutshell, what you're saying, Steve, is that culture has to be deeply cultivated for us to enable our leaders to continue to be accountable on the path that they've chosen. And that's something that organizations really need to be thinking about. What is their culture and how is it defined?
Yeah, and as long as it's bigger than self or bigger than money, I think we've got a sustainable model.
Thank you. Steve, thank you so much. And Jabulo, hi. Do you want to put your camera on? And
yes, I was still finding my camera. Hello.
And Jabulo, it's lovely to have you here. And as a committed and driven HR professional, and having explored these concepts with us today, what is HR's role in this uncharted space? And what needs to happen for HR to be able to challenge these toxic practices and bring about the change so desperately needed in organizations today? You know, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater, or do we really talk about how do we re-engineer? Tell us what your views and your experience and perspective is.
Yeah, let's just bomb the whole thing and start over. No, just kidding. Firstly, I love Carol's work, and thanks for setting that great context for us. I definitely think that HR has a big part to play as leaders and definitely as partners to the business. And I think firstly, it is around creating this consciousness around all of the issues that you've just spoken about. But more practically, definitely it's around redesigning the organization and the employee experience. That's really where I think our strength and our power comes in as HR, as a partner to the business. So starting with the organization, I would say a new organization is really required or needs to be built. And a big part of that, which you spoke about, is how do we also define contribution? So I see new organizations also being built around teams that are highly empowered with a different management model to what we know traditionally. And HR is really at the heart of partnering with CEOs, leadership, to really create this shared culture and engaging work environment. So it's really, for me, a shift from, I think talent management, and I have a talent management background, is key, but also sometimes in the driving the talent conversation, I think we've also been trapped in this view of also employees as commodities and how we use them, and you know, the trap of basically this consciousness that you, or lack of, that you've been talking about. I think it's more a shift towards employee experience. And this means then reflecting on how do we simplify processes, how do we build collaboration, how do we create space for innovation? And that means an interrogation for everything across the employee life cycle, you know? I mean, for me, the rate of change and digitization alone is enough to make us to rethink about the workspace. But certainly when you add all of these issues that you've just mentioned, we can't continue in the same way. So going back to teams, you know, I think with the design thinking lens, I think, you know, we're hearing a lot more around the iteration world, being agile, being flexible, allowing different ideas to flow. That can't really happen so easily in most organizations if you look at just the lack of interconnectedness, the lack of flexibility in terms of how the current structures and models are built. So I think it's about rethinking contribution, as I've just mentioned, from an employee perspective, and also building a network. So versus the traditional job description, it's more showing up to projects and a network of ideas and solutions and how we bring that. And that's a big thing because it does also then challenge our traditional models in terms of performance management, how we look at reward. Sorry, just my notes there, just jotted a few notes down, and just really how we even look at development as a whole, you know. For me, it's also challenging how we look at leadership. So the traditional leadership model is in trouble if you think, or if you listen to all of the points that have been mentioned. And HR is at the heart of, you know, we design these leadership models, leadership courses. If you think about the pyramid, it doesn't make sense. Besides the fact that it limits the number of leaders as we define it. But it also has this absurd definition of leadership where only a few people can be leaders, right? But if you really then start to think about leadership differently, leadership from a subject matter expert point of view, what we bring as contribution, fortunately, HR does own and often co-creates that whole leadership development space. And for me, it's how do we reshape that? I don't have all the answers, but I certainly know that we would need to start to identify leaders' aptitude, I would say, earlier and younger, and create environments where there's space for all the different types of leadership to exist. And it also then comes back to that conversation around how do we rethink the employee experience. We often talk about culture and engagement, but if you look at the current way of operating, it doesn't work. And we all agree that it doesn't work. So we should also admit, of course, that it's really complex to build meaningful and compelling work environments. Otherwise, we'd all be doing it and be thriving. So the complexity is definitely there, but we need to intentionally shift ourselves to, if I were to plot an employee journey, so definitely not bombing the whole thing, because I think if you look at the employee life cycle, it gives us those pointers in terms of the touch points, the milestones, but now rethinking each one of those to really say, from an employee journey and employee experience point of view, how do we enable a different experience? And then I think for me, one of the interesting points when you did the intro was really talking about the locus of control. For me, it's also about how employees show up, right? And employees owning their craft. And of course, yes, it's a symbiotic relationship. Organizations have to be prepared. But for me, there's also needs to be a shift in employees, really. It's not, I'm in this organization and I'm a victim and this is happening to me. And of course, we know it's because of the power dynamics, etc. But for me, in the ownership of your craft, then you show up as, how am I going to use this opportunity in this environment to contribute to my craft, to sharpen my craft, to become better, and start to just think about that experience in a different way as well. I think that's also that shift around the ownership, how I show up as an employee. And HR also plays a part in that, in creating this ecosystem where everybody is a player, the leaders, the employees themselves, the employees seeing themselves as contributors, as leaders. I think that's quite important. And then of course, it will inevitably lead to then shifting how we even look at learning and development, because then it's about creating appropriate learning opportunities rather than sheep. You know, we've got one course, it's for everybody in this grade, it's for everybody in the organization. But design thinking and being agile and experimenting means sometimes having those experiments with small groups of people, customizing experiences, having the prototypes and profiles. And I think that's different and maybe even difficult initially for HR to switch from, this is the policy and reference 5.2, this is what it says, but actually looking at you as the individual, as the contributor to our success as an organization.
So Geraldine, we all know talent acquisition is kind of the beginning point of an employee life cycle. And I know that you've spent 30 years in this space. We've had the privilege and the honor of working together on a couple of things. And I know that you and I have often debated, is there a better way? What needs to change? But, you know, you built up an internal resourcing capability in one of the largest banks in South Africa. We know that recruitment, talent acquisition is the cornerstone of the employee life cycle.
I mean, just to close off, and I was at the end, it's really around, as I was saying, moving away from pure compliance and creating experiences, and understanding that that's going to drive us into a completely different world that we maybe haven't operated in, and the whole concept of experimenting, trying out things. And that's really, I think I would say, the key of really what I wanted to say.
And Jabula, thank you so much, and really such valuable insights. And I think recognizing that this is a journey we're on, we don't have all the answers. We do know things need to change. And the question is how, and how do we do this? And I think the more that we collaborate as HR professionals on this journey, the sooner we're going to start coming up with these innovative ideas about what needs to happen. But thank you so much for your contribution. So Geraldine, back to you. If we consider these regenerative principles that we're talking about, we've spoken about competencies and job descriptions, which we know we use as the basis of how we recruit. And now we're talking about saying, well, actually, they're toxic. What would you change or shift to bring regenerative practices into the talent acquisition process?
Thanks, Jo. First of all, stop saying 30. To keep saying 30 years, I'm really feeling my age this morning. but stop saying 30. So I want to echo what Njabula and Steve are saying in that, and what you said just now. We don't have all of the answers. We have to look at these practices, at everything that we do, but we don't have, there's no magic bullet to fix it all, and it certainly will take a lot of work. So one of the things that really caught me about what Carol was saying about the organization, or the corporation was saying, is the organization is a psychopath, and that single-minded focus on commerciality. And I think that definitely pulls through into our hiring practices. And one of the big things, I mean, Jabula spoke about employee experience. I'm talking here about candidate experience. And if you talk about a process that strips personal agency, locus of control, all of those things, that's exactly what's happening in most talent acquisition practices at the moment. We talk about putting the candidate at the center, but there is a huge disconnect between a company's values, their purpose, and their stated sort of goals, and then what trickles down to a hiring manager and what actually happens in that process. It's become even more of a problem at the moment, where scarce skills are the things that we're looking for. We're looking for future skills. We're looking for people who've just started exploring these new ways of working. And the power has shifted actually to a candidate, but the hiring practices haven't. And so if you think about the application process that we have, whether you're an agency or an in-house recruiter, that strips away absolutely everything for a candidate. It is the most vulnerable process that we can actually go through. I mean, when I think about applying for a job, I mean, you're putting yourself out there, you're holding your thumbs, you're hoping, and the biggest complaint we get to candidates is that they hear nothing. So, I mean, that's across the board. If you look at all of the surveys that are done, that is the biggest complaint that candidates have. So how can you think about humanizing something, and then this is how we do things, and we don't ever get back to people? I often think, you know, if someone knelt down and said, "Will you marry me?" and you just walked off, never spoke to them again. I mean, what a devastating impact that has. And that definitely happens in our application process. We've also created such an imbalance in the way we interview, where the client is God and everything is around what the client wants. And that kind of fear in a lot of candidates shuts down all innovation. It shuts down all kind of expression. So everything that you're talking about, I mean, the interview situation doesn't allow for a person to actually show their potential. You know, it's deeply flawed. If I think about screening, we're talking about things like people still say the person must have a degree. The person might have 30 years experience, but they go, no, but they have to have a degree because it's on the job description. It's part of what they're looking for. And so everybody that doesn't meet that criteria gets, you know, pushed away. So there's a lot of talk, as I say, about how do we look at that differently. And then I have to say, you know, we sit with a really unusual situation in South Africa, well, a really difficult situation in South Africa with almost 42% unemployment. And so I know what recruiters and hiring managers have to deal with. I know the influx of applications that are absolutely no use to anyone. And so what we've done is introduce all these productivity tools. And the productivity tools take us as far away from human as you can be. A machine decides if you meet the criteria that somebody inputted from a job spec into a machine. And I understand the need for it, but we need to find a more human way of doing things. Absolutely. We need to find a way that actually connects with the person that, I mean, I hear all the time, you bring the whole person to work, but we don't consider the whole person when we're interviewing.
Yeah.
We don't, I mean, I've heard hiring managers talk about how cheeky some candidates are for asking questions. And it's not limited to certain companies or whatever. I find that there's a huge need for educating hiring managers, for helping them. Some of them only recruit once or twice a year, but they have a huge impact on that candidate population.
Absolutely.
How do we change how they talk to people, how they get into a conversation, how they actually understand that whole person? How do we start to limit the emphasis that we put onto things like levels of work? You'll hear companies saying, we're only going to take somebody with yeah?
I'm just mindful of time, Geraldine. You know, and I'm listening to you, and you know that this is my space and my passion too. And I think just, you know, to close off on what you were saying, imagine how many candidates out there that we haven't tapped into because we have these outdated, closed-minded way in which we evaluate what talent really is. And I think, you know, there has to be a better way, and we have to be thinking about how do we bring the whole person into that recruitment process and understand what value the whole person brings, not just the sum total of skills, knowledge, and experience, which is the whole commoditized way. So I just want to, before I hand over to, and Geraldine, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry I've had to cut you off. This is obviously a conversation that's so deep in everyone's hearts. Yeah. So I just want to close off very quickly before handing over to Lita, who's going to give us a lovely summary of what we've spoken about today. But the alternative to toxic practices and systems is based in our ability to engage in self-reflection. And the development of these three capabilities, I believe, is the remedy and should be our ultimate aim. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, and Jabulo and Geraldine, for your inputs and your insights. And Lita, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jo. I'm going to share with you the visual summary. You should see that on your screen appearing within a moment, and I'll be able to give you an overview of what we spoke about today. All right, so if we talk about corporations being classified as psychopaths, we have the big resignation, we've got massive disengagement, which is costing us $8.1 trillion a year. I hope, Joe, I got that right. You spoke about Carol Sanford's 3 elements, the locus of control, which is around questioning, self-development and resilience, the scope of considering how we consider other living beings, and that source of agency, allowing us to take initiatives where we find the authority, and the Me Too movement is an indication of that. A successful life happens where we are driven by purpose. And what I thought was really interesting is to change, we need to build a new model. And you spoke about the aristocracy that we need to change, where the CEO is not the only person in charge. And an example of that limitation is the job description, where people do not have the opportunity really to use their creativity. The machine paradigm, where we dehumanize our employees. For example, competencies, where people cannot innovate. Behavioral, we are conditioned, the idea of a rat came up with me. We are conditioned, for example, incentives leading to self-promotion. And then the human potential to internally focus, for example, surveys, which really just get the superficial reactions. If we think about purpose, organizational purpose, what is our why? What is the difference that we're making in the world? If we don't have that yet, it's almost too late. We need to think about purpose in a nested way, because we're part of that systemic approach, that shared value, what is good for me, what is good for you, what is good for the team and good for the community. And we spoke about the example of vitality. Rigorously cultivated cultures, we have to keep our leaders accountable within the context and within the culture that we have. And then we spoke about HR's role. We need to redesign the organization. We need to design the employee experience deliberately, creating a shared culture of empowerment and contribution, but also asking, how do employees show up at work? Rethinking leadership, development, talents, and incentives. Our leadership model needs to change, and we shouldn't allow the HR policies to hold us back. And then finally, in terms of talent and talent acquisition, there's no magic bullet. Unfortunately, there's a disconnect between the values and the candidate experience. The candidates should have the power, but they don't feel like they do. It's like asking someone to marry you and they just walk off. We need to find a more human way to acquire talent. And we need to train our managers to hire in a better way, in a more humane way. So that is the visual summary. Joe, back over to you.
We've got literally a minute or so. And Steve, one of the questions that came up, and I'd love to just quickly direct it to you, and then we can close off. Ursula Fear, thank you. You said, how do you help people to discover their purpose? What's your thoughts there, Steve?
Well, the first thing I think that that you do, you can ask some very, very key questions, and there's some quickest way to do it. There's a very simplistic model that Simon Sinek has come up with. Obviously you know him from Start With Why. He's got a book now called Finding Your Why, and he gives you a very linear process. But equally, I'd say that at some point is going to be limited to your level of consciousness. So it's a journey. So you have to spend some time on yourself, understanding the kinds of things that drive you, give you meaning, and I think you'll get closer to it. But it's a very hard question to answer in a minute, Joe.
My apologies, I know. And Simon Sinek's work is absolutely incredible, and I definitely agree with you. I mean, I started my journey with my purpose. Is start with the why, and it was Simon Sinek's question that really triggered me to say, well, where am I in this whole living system? I'd love to share some more time, but unfortunately time is up. I just want to thank my panelists. Thank you so much. I want to thank Talent Talks, Sue Duval, Life Online, Karen Cole, and of course, Lita, with your amazing work. And just a reminder, guys, that the next webinar in the series will be in February next year. We've decided not to do it in December because I think everyone is feeling somewhat frazzled. And we look forward to sharing with you what that's going to be about. And once again, thank you so much for your time.